There are near about endless ways a watch manufacturer can justify increasing the price of their watches. Could be within their marketing, very well the advanced materials that they deploy, complications, unique manufacturing processes. The list can go on. How many of those things matter to you? I have here both two of the most popular dive watches within the enthusiast circles. On the left, the Squale 1521, the militare version of course, and the bead blasted steel case, and on the right, the SPB 187 Seiko Marine Master circa 2020. The reason I'm bringing on these watches to discuss, although they're older releases, is the fact of the matter that newer doesn't always mean better. And with all the price increases I've seen lately within these two brands alone, I think it's worthwhile looking at the old catalog. These two watches can be picked up just around that $1,000 mark in the used pre-owned market, of course, and I think there's an argument to be said there. I think a better comparison of the SPB 187 might be the 1521 Sunray with the polished steel case and the bracelet. However, I'm not talking simply watch for watch, it's more about what these two watches represent within the space that they do. In the dive watch community, in the enthusiast circles, these two are very celebrated. Even though the 1521 Militare has a bead blasted case, I'm talking about the value of what they represent, the quality of them, the on-the-wrist comfort, which are all very similar. And in that, it'll be consistent whether you choose the 1521 polished or sunray dial versus the Militare. And on that note, which one would you choose if it were to be your $1,000 spent? Would it be the Seiko or the Squale? I'd love to hear your comments. 26 for around $1,000. Where would you spend your money if it had to be just between these two choices? The Squale 1521 Militare or the Seiko SPB 187 Baby Marine Master. They offer similarities, both have around 200 meters of water resistance, they're highly popular dive watches, 120 click bezels, both are in steel, both have sword hands and 430 crown positions. The area of which these two watches begin to differ is in their lume application, with the Squale 1521 baton indices and fully lumed bezel being a very distinctive departure from the Seiko. Talking about under living room lighting, initial impressions are positive. It's fairly bright, legible. Charging it up with a UV light, it appears quite bright, but under 15 minutes later, it looks like this. So make of it what you will. That is the brightness of the Squale. Let's take a look at the Seiko. The Seiko, on the other hand, has a more traditional applied indices that are rounded off, sword hands of course, not a lumed bezel. And so turning off the lights within my room were yielded this result. Charging it up with the UV light, we are introduced to one of the brightest lume applications in the business. Seiko certainly doesn't disappoint with their LumiBright. Waiting about 15 minutes yields us this result. The Seiko appears to be just a smidge bit dimmer than the Squale. There's a marginal difference, as I said, between the two lume application on both Seiko and Squale. Perhaps you can make an argument to say the Seiko is a smidge brighter, but the Squale stays brighter a little bit longer than the Seiko. Sound off in the comments, what do you think about the lume application between these two watches and which one would you choose on that basis? These two dials on both dive watches could not be any more different. The Seiko has a beautiful sunray deep ocean blue color, applied indices, faceted hands, polished on the upper level, brushed on the lower level. It even has a rudimentary cutout date window with a complete dial indice for the ISO certification. So speaking of the furnishings, this means the sharpness of the text to the cleanliness of the hands, and as well as just how it's executed altogether, the Seiko is very good. I have reviewed and owned several Squale watches over the years, and I have found the dial quality to always be exceptional, and I liken that to the fact that they have their own in-house dial maker in Neuchâtel, and they pour over all the fine details. This texturized matte black finishing with how sharp the printed dial indices are, combined with the cleanliness of the hands, just overall pleasantness of the dial cannot be understated. Squale's done a great job. Both of these are comparable in size when you look at the spec sheet. In reality, they're slightly different. The Squale, although 42mm in the Seiko 42mm wide diameter as well, it is actually a 40.4mm case with a wider 42mm bezel sitting on top. The Seiko is fairly consistent as the bezel is parallel or in line with the case. In terms of case thickness, the Squale wins out slightly at just a hair under 13mm thick, whereas the Seiko sits at 13.1 millimeters. I have measured the Seiko at 48.8 millimeters lug-to-lug distance, but when you take the effective wingspan of the bracelet end lengths, it's closer to 50 millimeters. The Squale, on the other hand, tracks in at only 48 millimeters lug-to-lug distance, with end lengths that pivot inboard to the case, which means wrist comfort will be slightly better on the Squale if you've got a smaller wrist. The 1521 has one of the most critically acclaimed dive cases in the industry. Part of that comes down to how it's only 12.5 millimeters thick. That is from the fact that the crystal lays relatively in line with the bezel, mentioning that the case can also be had in bead blasted or polished variants. We see here that the Militare is completely bead blasted from top to bottom. There's not a single bit of polished element here. Of course, in comparison, the Seiko has bezels, facets for days. What do I mean by that? The grammar of design language that Seiko is well known for in its dive watches is ever prevalent here, which means stubby lugs, bevels from the top of the mid case, brushed surfaces split between high polished, and you have a very intricate case design in relative comparison to the Squale, which also appears to be flatter, more angular flanks and facets in comparison. The crown is also at 430 inset and has a natural crown guard built within the case. The Seiko has drilled lug holes for easy switching out of straps, and I think that's a perk that I wish the Squale had. One is not better than the other in terms of the specs alone. You'll have to make sense of what's important to you. I feel that the thinner case design of a Squale appeals to me personally, but that might be different for someone who likes a more complex case and may go for the Seiko. Comfort is really similar between both of them. Both watches have a similar fold-over clasp, and it does come from a 20mm from the end link, tapers down to 18, and then widens slightly out to about 20mm from the buckle. Taper on them is similar, but the articulation of the 1521 H-link bracelet is impressive. Each link is connected by a screw pin system. I've heard complaints online that many people are not happy with the fold-over clasp, that it is a little bit cheap feeling. I don't feel like it is on the lower end, but I do understand and appreciate that they could have gone for a more refined clasp with a push-button extension system instead of the more traditional pull-out extension system. It is a nice bracelet, it flows beautifully, each link does articulate on its own, and I think that overall, is it worthwhile pairing with the 1521? It doesn't take away from the watch. What's apparent with the Seiko bracelet is that although it is also steel, it weighs a little bit more than the Squale bracelet. I find that the individual links are thicker, the fold-over clasp a little bit thinner, the flow and articulation of the links still pretty good, but not nearly as fluid and comfortable as the Squale. Each of the links are connected by a pin and collar system, so you have to be extra diligent not to lose any of the collars when you are adjusting or removing a link. However, you'll have the safety and security that technically pin and collars are more secure. It does have a dive extension system that you pull out from underneath. It's a little bit tricky to operate, lots of friction that holds it in place. The fold-over clasp is nothing remarkable, but neither is the Squale. The finishing of the bracelet, is very good. Squale doesn't see anything wrong with the 1521 having an aluminum bezel insert, as across the model range, that is exactly the type of bezel that you see. It is texturized, it has warmth, it's lovely. The beauty of the 1521 bezel action is that it has little to no play in it, 120 clicks, and every detent is heard and felt. You can also adjust the tension of the bezel with small adjustment screws on the side of the bezel shroud. Seiko has opted for a glossy steel bezel insert for the SPB 187. Feels like ceramic, but it isn't as resilient. I think that the bezel action on the Seiko at 120 clicks, my example is a few years old now, and it does have a bit of bezel play, so it's not fair to compare to the Squale. It is a good bezel with audible detents and quite smooth, in fact, smoother with less resistance to turn than the Squale, but by no means loose or insecure where it would maybe move on its own. Once locked in place, it's all good. There are two major differences between these two watches, the movement and the water resistance. The Seiko has only 200 meters versus the Squale's 500 meters. And the movements, the Sellita SW200 is commonly used in the Squale, 28,800 vibrations per hour, whereas the Seiko has a 6R35 movement that beats at 21,600 vibrations per hour. My wrist size is roughly 6.5 inches wide, so a 42mm case like the Squale would be the upper limit of what I can handle. More importantly is the wingspan. 48mm lug-to-lug length fits right within the dimensions of my wrist. If you got a wrist as small as 6.3 inches, you could probably get away with Squale, but you'd be pushing it. Here's the SPB187 on my wrist, and I tend to wear my watches just above the wrist bone, so you can see that it does sit quite flat and comfortably on my wrist. Your mileage may vary in terms of the shape of your wrist, but I think both watches are pretty comparable for how they feel in terms of their footprint on the wrist. As I've mentioned, the 48.8mm long wingspan of the Seiko is just the case lug-to-lug length, not including the end links that pivot outboard with the bracelet. However, the saving grace is that the case is quite curvaceous, as it hugs my flat wrist beautifully with hardly any gaps between the bracelet and the case. Visually, the more slender case of the Squale, meaning that the lugs seem to appear longer visually, it's deceptive, as the 48mm wingspan suggests it will be more comfortable on smaller wrists than the Seiko. The Squale has 300 meters extra water resistance than the Seiko, which means the case back will stick out a little bit more proudly, and it creates a small gap between the wrists, but it isn't uncomfortable. There isn't a gap between the bracelet to the wrist, however, and that's what's important for comfort. In closing thoughts, I didn't talk much about the movement of both watches, but it is worthy of mention. The Seiko SPB187 has the 6R35 movement, which I've read numerous accounts on Reddit and watch forums that the movement has accuracy issues based on its position, whether face down, face up, or on the wrist. It doesn't seem to be very accurate and has variances, whereas the Squale, on the other hand, has the tried and trusted Sellita SW200, and it tends to be more accurate out of the box than the Seiko. Now, if you were to buy both of these watches, I find that you're out of luck for the SPB187, just by simple measure that it's been discontinued, and the newer version of this would be the GMT, I believe the SPB383. I may have gotten that reference wrong, but you'd be looking at used, pre-owned. So around that $1,000 mark, you could find a clean example of one of these watches, but you have to go in full well knowing that it is going to be an older watch, and buying new, you'd be looking at the Squale 1521, which is about 1,400 Canadian dollars, which represents great value in terms of a brand new watch, but pre-owned you can find them for much less than that, and I think it is a very compelling purchase, any 1521 for that matter. I've actually owned both of these watches in different times of my collecting journey, if you can say that, and I find that in each collection you may be able to justify both of these, and that would be the perfect world. Thank you so much for watching today. If you liked today's video, please leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.